With me on the program this morning, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo, the Shadow Employment Minister, Brendan O'Connor. Gentlemen, good morning to you. Brendan O'Connor, first to you. Are you comfortable with the way that this is being managed thus far from the government? The Greens and others are worried that there is not a clear goal, a clear enough goal being set here, that there could be mission creep and we could be stuck there for years.
Well, the opposition supports the government in its humanitarian attempts to provide relief for people in that region. We also welcome the resolve of the countries present at the Paris conference. And of course, as the former government created an opportunity for the current government to sit on the UN Security Council, there's a forthcoming meeting chaired by Secretary of State Kerry that's also very important. So I think we certainly will work with the government. The government's briefing the opposition regularly about the challenges that lay ahead, but we must act, and we must do so in a considered way. And I guess the threshold point for us would be, Kieran, that we would want to see, combat troops beyond what's already been put. We would want to see sort of formed up combat troops on the ground in Iraq.
Steve Ciobo, from the government's perspective, it would be encouraging to hear that sort of message out of Paris, including, as I mentioned in my introduction to the program, a number of significant Sunni majority countries like Saudi Arabia.
Sure. And look, Kieran, that is the case. I mean, as a government, we of course welcome the opposition's support. I think it is important that as a nation we stand together. We stand, to use the phrase, as Team Australia. And the important thing to realise in relation to this too, Kieran, is that we're not just talking about this being some far-off conflict. They are, of course, sadly, tentacles that extend from the epicentre of this, which is of course Iraq and Syria, but they spread around the world. And we know that here in Australia we face an elevated threat as a consequence of the numbers of Australians that are involved in terrorist activity and that are battle-hardened, again for lack of a better term, in Syria and places like Iraq. So I think the resolution of the international community to stand up to those who would do the world harm, to stand up against those who seemingly just pay absolutely no respect to human life at all, is an important outcome, a solid outcome, and it really underscores this government's commitment to making sure we stand up for Australia's national interest.
Does it mean, Steve Ciobo, that we have to at times as well work with some people and groups that would not, any other time would not be our allies? For example, the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, that is designated as a terrorist organisation, terrorist group in this country.
Well, look, I mean, obviously we've got to deal with the situation at hand. There's no shortcuts in any of this, Kieran. These are protracted, difficult, complex problems. I have seen some calls for people to say, well, we want to know what the easy pathway in and what the easy pathway out is. I think that really does an injustice to what it is that we're trying to deal with here. The fact is that these are protracted, complex problems, and Australia will do its role alongside countries like the United States and the UK to stand up for what we believe are fundamental human values of freedom, of liberty, of respect of law, of the sanctity of human life. And so we've got to work with those that are willing to draw a line in the sand and say to death cults like ISIL, we are not going to tolerate this kind of activity by you lot, and so we're going to do what we can to defend what it is that makes the human world civilised.
Brendan O'Connor, what are your thoughts on these reports this morning in the Fairfax Press, News to the Herald and The Age report this morning, that they have evidence that the PKK has been working alongside the Peshmerga in northern Iraq, and therefore we're supporting a group, as I say, that's designated, prescribed as a terrorist organisation?
Well, I think it just really underlines how challenging this matter is for not only this country but for the world, who needs to deal with terrorism in such a convincing manner. I think, therefore, we rely upon the advice from intelligence agencies and other agencies of government. But I think the overall issue here, Kieran, is to stand back and watch ISIL commit the evil that it's committing is not is just not something that we can do. What is really critical, and that's why I think it's so important to see what happens out of the conference that was held in Paris and the collaboration by countries within the region of the Middle East, is what they will do. I think it's very important, and I think that the President of the United States and others have mentioned, including our Prime Minister, that it is important to see a level of engagement and resolve by those neighbouring countries. Now, of course, from time to time, you're going to be engaging or building alliances with groups you may not ordinarily do. But this is not an ordinary situation. We're confronted with a very exceptional situation where barbaric acts are happening and they must be put to an end, and that can only happen with the collaboration of countries around the world and working with, of course, the countries of goodwill in that region. Without that happening, we don't know how far this will escalate, but I do believe this is a security issue well beyond the region of Iraq and the Middle East if it's allowed to go unchecked.
Okay, I'll be back with Brendan O'Connor and Steve Ciobo in just a moment. This is AM Agenda. Thanks for your company. With me this morning, Liberal frontbencher Steve Ciobo and the Shadow Employment Minister Brendan O'Connor. Steve Ciobo, there are reports in The Australian this morning that the government's looking at a cashless welfare card to replace welfare management. This is a proposal put forward originally by Andrew Forrest, the mining magnate. What are your thoughts on this? Is this where the direction the government's heading?
Well, Kieran, as we've said previously in response to this report, it's a brave report. We think the ambition of the report is strong, but importantly, this is a report to government, not a report of government. So it's something that we want to have a national conversation about. I mean, historically, Kieran, I've, on a personal level, made calls for the introduction of this kind of system. I personally, and I stress this is my view, not the government's view, take the view that a cashless welfare payment is the right way to go. You know, again, in my view, I don't think taxpayers should be funding for people on welfare to have a beer at the pub, a flat on the pokies, or a packet of cigarettes. So I think it is the right way forward, but ultimately the government will take a decision in due course, but I think it's important the community has the discussion.
What are your thoughts, Brendan O'Connor?
Well, we're waiting on the government to respond to the report that effectively the Prime Minister commissioned by asking Mr Forrest to report to government. So I think it's important for government to respond. My general response to the report is that it's worth examining. It was Labor that looked at income management in areas where people were very vulnerable in a way to ensure that we could provide more effective support for them, and that money was not being misused, and therefore children, for example, weren't missing out on the income payments being made to families. So we've taken those steps before. We are examining the report. I think there are certainly some worthy intentions, and I think it's certainly worth examining, and we need to do so based on what will work. I should also say, Kieran, that the Leader of the Opposition and certainly other frontbenchers of the opposition are engaging with Mr Forrest. I'll be catching up with Andrew Forrest, as will a number of other frontbenchers, to talk about these matters in the coming weeks. So we're certainly wanting to see reform here if it's going to lead to better outcomes for those people that rely on such income.
All right, let's look at one other issue before we wrap up this morning. The Prime Minister to cut tax burden on employee share schemes, apparently. Again, in The Australian this morning, Steve Ciobo, is this an area of reform the government thinks is necessary? Obviously, you're worried about tax receipts as well. So for bigger companies, this is something you probably won't be doing, I wouldn't have thought, with the larger corporations.
Well, Kieran, I was going to say we've had a great unity ticket so far this morning. Brendan and I have been speaking as one almost, but I think on this we're going to differ. Look, the fundamental issue here is that Labor completely stuffed up employee share schemes when they were in office. They created uncertainty. They created a culture where people didn't really know what was going on. So this is something the government's going to have a close look at as part of our competitiveness agenda. We are focused in like a laser about making sure that Australia is more competitive in the future, that we maximise our economic potential, we really capitalise on the competitive advantages that we have, and we incentivise employees and employers to work cohesively as a team for the betterment of not only themselves but the Australian nation. And employee share ownership schemes are one way that we can do that, by really addressing a lot of the shortfalls that were left by the previous Labor government.
Would it be more for smaller companies though? Is that what's in sight here?
Well, I'm not going to preempt the announcement, Kieran, about what might be happening as part of our competitiveness agenda. What I am saying is that there's a problem here. The government's looked at the problem. We're determined to fix it. We know that the use of these schemes can be very effective in both, as I said, incentivising employers and employees and creating value-added models for businesses. So that's what we'll take a good look at.
Well, it's certainly, Brendan O'Connor, it does seem like a good approach, certainly for startups and organisations like that, to provide the incentive for entrepreneurs to have a crack.
Oh, look, I'm going to disappoint Steve and actually agree with the principle of examining this. I think that we should, and indeed Bill Shorten back in March this year said we should review this, because I think there are opportunities. I do think you have to watch out about how it impacts on tax, but certainly as the former small business minister, I think the need for startups and smaller enterprises finding ways to attract talented staff, enabling them to use such a vehicle for success is worth examining. I mean, we'll see what the government is putting forward, but I think in principle we should be open to providing these types of opportunities for such enterprises.
Who would have thought it? 3 out of 3 gentlemen on
Sorry about that, Kieran.
bipartisan
I know you don't
ticket.
like agreement on your show, you know.
No, that's all right. It's good to have it on occasion. Thanks, gents. Have a good day.
Thanks, Kieran.
We're going to cross lines to Auckland now. Natasha Smith is standing by. Natasha.